The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. In America's most forgotten prisons, men live and die in silence. Not from violence alone, but from neglect, from heat so intense it peels skin, from medical calls that go unanswered, from cells where the water hasn't run in months. These aren't scenes from a movie. These are real conditions documented in federal reports from places like Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama and Angola Prison in Louisiana, two institutions known worldwide for brutality, overcrowding, and systemic abandonment. Tonight, we step inside the shadows of these hidden prisons, the ones the public never sees, where inmates say they are not serving sentences, they are surviving them. The history of forgotten prisons. When Americans picture prison, they imagine structured routines, guards watching every corridor, and facilities where, even if harsh, basic human needs are still met. But hidden deep in rural states, far from public oversight, exist prisons historically neglected for decades. Their reputations grew quietly, whispered through investigative reports, lawsuits, and inmate testimonies. Among these are Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama and the Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola. Both institutions are rooted in histories that shaped their brutality long before the modern era. Holman opened in 1969, intended as a maximum security prison with a death row unit. From the beginning, it struggled with overcrowding, understaffing, and lack of funding. Reports from the 1970s and 1980s showed repeated warnings about failing infrastructure and violent inmate conditions. Yet nothing changed. It became known nationally as the House of Pain, a place where stabbings were so frequent that correctional officers entered tears wearing makeshift protective gear. Angola's story is even darker. Built on a former slave plantation, its operations mirrored plantation labor systems for most of the 20th century. Prisoners, overwhelmingly black, worked cotton field from sunrise to sunset under armed guards on horseback. For decades, Angola generated millions through forced labor. This legacy of exploitation created a culture where pain and punishment were normalized. It wasn't uncommon for men to die in the fields, their deaths barely mentioned beyond paperwork. As the years passed, both institutions evolved, but not in ways that erased their pasts. Funding remained minimal. Maintenance was ignored. Critical systems, plumbing, ventilation, medical facilities deteriorated. In Holman, cell toilets rusted until they no longer flushed. In Angola, infirmary rooms became so overcrowded that prisoners slept on the floor beside men battling terminal illnesses. Federal investigators documented everything, but year after year, change barely trickled through. The root cause? Location and invisibility. These prisons were built in remote, isolated areas. Holman sits at the edge of Atmore, Alabama, a rural town with limited economic resources. Angola covers 18,000 acres surrounded by swamps and wildlife, accessible only by two-lane highways. Their isolation made them ideal for something few admit openly: out-of-sight punishment. When facilities are far from major cities, there are fewer activists, fewer reporters, and fewer visitors. With no outside eyes to witness conditions daily, deterioration continued unchecked. Over the years, inmates began describing the same pattern. The more the buildings decayed, the more administrators relied on punishment rather than repair. Broken plumbing meant buckets for toilets. Lack of air conditioning meant inmates fainting from heat exhaustion. Understaffing led to entire blocks being run by inmates instead of officers. When the public heard about riots or violence in these prisons, what they didn't hear was the cause: desperation. One former Holman inmate said in a sworn affidavit that the smell inside the building was a combination of sweat, sewage, and metal, adding that he hadn't seen a working ventilation system in years. A federal judge reviewing conditions at Angola once compared certain cell blocks to worse than barn stalls. The comparison was not an exaggeration. Photos from investigations showed mold-covered showers, exposed wiring, and cells with no lighting. As public pressure occasionally forced internal evaluations, states responded not with repairs, but with temporary patches. A pipe would be replaced, but the plumbing system around it remained broken. A medical wing would be repainted, but supplies stayed limited. The deeper issues, low budgets, political neglect, and a culture of punishment, were never addressed. Prisoners, especially those on long sentences, began to understand that the system would not change. Many stopped filing grievances. Others organized hunger strikes or wrote letters to journalists, hoping someone would listen. Yet for every story that surfaced, hundreds more disappeared into silence. The neglect extended beyond physical infrastructure. Psychological support was nearly non-existent. Inmates suffering from trauma, addiction, or mental illness were left untreated. Holman's mental health unit was described by a 2019 report as in crisis, with suicidal inmates often placed in solitary confinement, a practice known to worsen mental deterioration. Angola's long history of forced labor added another dimension of psychological harm. Many inmates described feeling like they had stepped back into a time period where human rights didn't exist. Even after labor reforms, the emotional weight of the prison's history clung to its hallways. Guards, many of whom came from families that had worked the plantation for generations, maintained strict, often harsh discipline. The combination of decaying structures, violent environments, and historical trauma created what experts call institutional hopelessness. In such places, survival becomes the primary goal. Former prisoners said they slept lightly, listening for footsteps in the hall. Others reported developing chronic anxiety, even long after their release. Yet through all of this, these prisons remained largely unknown outside their states. While federal agencies occasionally demanded improvements, national audiences paid little attention. Unlike high-profile cases in urban centers, rural prison neglect rarely made headlines. Politicians avoided the topic, and communities near the prisons often relied on them for employment, creating conflict between economic needs and human rights concerns. The story of America's worst prisons is not just about crime and punishment. It is about abandonment, the systematic neglect of facilities housing thousands of people, many mentally ill, impoverished, or serving sentences for nonviolent offenses. It is about systems allowed to rot because the people inside are unpopular and easily ignored. This chapter sets the foundation for understanding the crisis. In the next chapters, we enter the present-day reality. The heat, the medical neglect, the violence, and the psychological destruction that define life inside America's most forgotten prisons. Inside America's most forgotten prisons, survival is not measured in years. It is measured in hours. Day by day, heat wave by heat wave, medical emergency by medical emergency. For inmates in places like Holman and Angola, the conditions are not just uncomfortable, they are life-threatening. The reality is simple, documented repeatedly through federal inspections, lawsuits, and testimonies. These prisons were not built to keep anyone safe. They were built to contain, and over time, they were left to decay. The most dangerous threat inside these facilities is heat. In summer months, temperatures inside concrete cell blocks routinely climb above 100 degrees. In some death row units, it has reached over 110. With no air conditioning and poor ventilation, the cells turn into ovens. Metal bunks heat up until they burn skin. Walls sweat with condensation. Men lie on the floor, trying to breathe, pressing their faces against cracks beneath the door where slightly cooler air leaks through. Heat stroke, dehydration, and fainting are not rare. They are expected. In Holman, several inmates have reported hallucinating during extreme heat. One described seeing waves move across his cell. Another said that he felt like he was drowning even though the room was dry. At Angola, Older prisoners and those with heart conditions suffered most. Some collapsed during roll call. Others died from heat-related complications that went unreported or were labeled as natural causes. Guards worked in the same heat, but inmates spent nearly every hour in it, trapped behind thick metal doors. Broken infrastructure made everything worse. Plumbing failures meant toilets stayed backed up for weeks. Some cells had no running water at all. Holman inmates described using plastic bottles to store the little water they were given, rationing sips throughout the day. In Angola, entire dorms went without clean water during maintenance shutdowns. Men washed with water that came out brown, smelling of metal and earth. Showers, when they worked, were mold-covered with peeling paint and exposed pipes. The smell of these conditions, the mix of sewage, sweat, mildew, and heat, clung to everything. Former inmates said the odor soaked into their clothes, their blankets, even their skin. Visitors reported the same. One attorney who toured a Holman unit described the air as heavy and wet, like breathing through a dirty towel. Another said she had to step outside twice during her inspection just to keep from vomiting. Medical care, already strained in most prisons, was almost non-existent in these facilities. At Holman, a federal investigation revealed that the prison often had no doctor on site. Nurses, overwhelmed and under-resourced, made quick rounds without proper equipment. Medications ran out. Records were lost. Emergency calls were ignored for hours. Inmates described banging on their doors, begging for help, only to be told they needed to wait until morning. At Angola, the situation was worse because of the prison's enormous size. Sick or injured inmates had to be transported by van or by wheelchair across long distances to the medical building. Many never made it in time. Testimonies tell of men having seizures on the walk, lying on the gravel as guards called for backup. For some, backup never came. The infirmary often ran at full capacity. Terminally ill inmates slept in hallways or on thin mattresses placed on the floor. The smell of infection, urine, and disinfectant blended into a constant haze. Men with chronic illnesses, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, frequently went untreated. Some lost limbs. Some went blind. A lawsuit once revealed that an inmate died from untreated sores after his wounds became infected with maggots. Investigators confirmed the report. Another case described an inmate who fractured his jaw but waited weeks for treatment. Surviving on liquid food, he tried to push through the small gaps between his teeth. Mental health care was nearly non-existent. Suicidal inmates were often placed in solitary confinement instead of receiving counseling. These cells were small concrete boxes with little light and no bedding. Men in crisis were stripped naked and left with nothing but a suicide smock. Some spent days there. Some spent weeks. Federal monitors noted that these conditions directly increased self-harm attempts rather than reducing them. The lack of medical care created another silent killer: infections. Cuts, rashes, and wounds spread rapidly because of humid conditions and poor sanitation. Staph infections became common. Some inmates wrapped their arms or legs with makeshift bandages torn from clothes. Others relied on fellow prisoners for help. Men with no training doing what they could to treat wounds using toothpaste, soap, or diluted commissary bleach. It was dangerous, but it was better than nothing. Food conditions added another layer of suffering. Meals were small, often cold, and frequently spoiled. In Holman, inmates said the beans sometimes smelled sour and the rice had insects in it. In Angola, meat served in the chow hall was so tough and discolored that many refused to eat it. Those who could afford commissary relied heavily on ramen noodles, chips, and processed snacks. Those who couldn't were forced to eat whatever was provided, no matter how unsafe it looked. Because of the overcrowding and lack of staff, inmates sometimes waited in long lines outdoors before entering the chow hall, standing in heat so intense that several collapsed. Water fountains near the hall often didn't work. Guards sometimes told inmates to deal with it, adding to the sense that suffering was simply part of daily life. Everyday tasks became survival challenges. Taking a shower, getting medication, avoiding heat stroke, finding drinkable water. Protecting food from insects. These were not occasional issues. They were the constant reality of living inside these prisons. The harsh conditions also altered social dynamics. Fear and frustration made tempers short. Violence increased, not from gang conflict alone, but from desperation. When water was shut off, fights broke out over bottles. When the heat reached dangerous levels, inmates argued over spots near fans, even if the fans barely worked. Tensions rose between cellmates forced to live for months in rooms no bigger than a closet, sweating through nights with no air and dealing with overflowing toilets. Despite the severity of these conditions, official responses remained slow. When journalists reported on the heat crisis, states defended themselves by pointing to budget limitations. When medical neglect was exposed, prison administrators claimed staffing shortages. When photos of collapsing ceilings surfaced, repairs were promised and then postponed. As long as the public rarely saw the inside of these prisons, there was little pressure to act. Inmate families knew the truth. They saw the exhaustion on their loved ones' faces during visits. They heard the desperation in their voices during phone calls. Some filed complaints. Some held protests. But their voices were small compared to the size of the system. Inside Holman and Angola, men learned the same lesson. Help rarely comes. The violence no one sees. Gang control, staff shortages, and daily survival. Violence inside America's forgotten prisons is not random. It is predictable. It rises from the same conditions that have existed for decades: extreme overcrowding, failing infrastructure, and severe staff shortages. In places like Holman and Angola, violence became part of the daily rhythm long before the public heard anything about it. For many inmates, survival depends on navigating a system where danger comes from every direction. Other prisoners failing security measures, and sometimes even the staff meant to protect them. The foundation of prison violence starts with understaffing. Holman Correctional Facility has been known for some of the worst staffing shortages in the country. At multiple points, federal monitors reported that the prison operated with only a fraction of the officers it needed. Some dorms had one officer for 120 inmates. Other nights, there were no officers on a dorm at all. Prisoners controlled the tiers. They made the rules. Officers stayed near the entrance, refusing to walk down the hall because it was too dangerous. This lack of staff caused a power shift. Gangs became the regulators, the enforcers, and the peacekeepers. In Holman, groups like the Gangster Disciples, the Bloods, and the Simon City Royals divided control of dorms. In Angola, prison gangs weren't as openly structured on paper, but inmate-run groups controlled medication lines, showers, phones, and even work assignments. These groups filled the role that officers no longer could. They settled disputes. They enforced discipline. They punished those who broke unwritten rules. With so little supervision, violence rose sharply. Holman's stabbing rate became one of the highest in the nation. Reports showed inmates creating homemade blades from bed frames, fan parts, or stolen pieces of metal. Some carried knives every hour of the day. Others had blades in shoes or beneath mattresses. Inmates often used weapons for protection, but many incidents started with simple conflicts: arguments over a phone call, disputes over bunk space, or debts from gambling or contraband. Angola, despite being more organized on paper, faced similar dangers. The prison's massive size made it impossible for staff to monitor everything. Some areas were so isolated that violence could occur without anyone noticing for hours. Inmates in certain dorms said that after dark, the place turned into its own world. Men walked in shadows, trading contraband, settling debts, or preparing for fights. Prisoners with gangster tattoos often acted as lookouts, signaling when officers were approaching. The violence wasn't only inmate on inmate. It also came from the system itself. With too few officers, staff relied heavily on force to control large groups. Pepper spray, batons, and extraction teams became common. In Holman, officers sometimes sprayed entire dorms instead of individuals, causing dozens of inmates to cough and choke in poorly ventilated rooms. In Angola, Extraction teams were known for using overwhelming force to remove inmates from cells, even when the inmate wasn't resisting. The combination of heat and neglect made everyone more volatile. Tempers rose quickly. A broken fan or power outage could turn a dorm into a pressure cooker. During lockdowns, things escalated faster. Men trapped for days or weeks in tiny cells, without showers, without recreation, without proper food, often snapped under the pressure. Officers, also overworked and stressed, responded with force, creating a cycle of retaliation and distrust. Contraband played a large role in the violence. Cell phones, drugs, and homemade alcohol moved through the prison, controlled largely by gangs. With little staff supervision, inmates built entire networks. Phones were used to coordinate fights, arrange drug deliveries, or contact outside associates. At times, contraband operations were so organized that they resembled small criminal enterprises. Debts from contraband created some of the deadliest situations. If an inmate couldn't pay what he owed, violence followed. Some were beaten. Others were stabbed. Some requested protective custody, but were denied due to overcrowding. One former Holman inmate said, "You either pay or you bleed." Another described seeing fights erupt over ramen noodles, phone time, or spaces near the window where the air was slightly cooler. Violence also came from desperation. When inmates are forced to live in heat over 100 degrees, with no running water, mold-filled showers, and constant fear, their mental state changes. Some become paranoid. Some become aggressive. Some lose the ability to tolerate even small frustrations. A simple misunderstanding can become a fatal conflict. The lack of medical care made violent outcomes even worse. Stabbing victims often waited hours before receiving treatment. Some bled alone in their cells. Others were carried by fellow inmates to the infirmary because no officers responded to emergency calls. One reported case from Angola described a man who was stabbed multiple times, left on the floor for nearly an hour before help arrived. He survived, but only barely. Fear shaped inmates' behavior. Many avoided certain areas. Some refused to shower at specific times because those were known as dangerous hours. Others slept in their clothes, ready to run if something happened. The constant awareness of danger created psychological damage. Inmates described feeling like prey, always watching, always listening for footsteps behind them. Staff were not safe either. Officers, often young and inexperienced, worked 16-hour shifts because of shortages. Some were attacked on duty, caught in violent conflicts they couldn't control. Others admitted they avoided certain tiers. Some officers quit after a few months, describing the environment as out of control or a time bomb waiting to go off. In places with such extreme conditions, violence becomes more than an event. It becomes a culture, a way of life, a constant pressure that shapes everything inmates do. It affects how they walk, how they talk, where they sit, who they trust, and how they navigate each day. Some inmates adopt a hardened persona, adding tattoos and aligning with stronger groups for protection. Others withdraw completely, keeping to themselves and avoiding any interaction that might lead to conflict. Despite the overwhelming violence, many incidents never make it into official reports. Some officers don't file paperwork because they are overwhelmed. Some inmates don't report injuries because they fear retaliation. Some simply believe reporting doesn't matter. As a result, the official statistics show only a fraction of the true violence inside these prisons. Outside the walls, the public rarely sees this reality. When violence makes the news, it is usually about a riot, a stabbing death, or a major disturbance. What the public doesn't see is the daily violence, the threats, the intimidation, the silent rules run by inmates because the system itself has failed. In Holman and Angola, violence is not a symptom. It is a consequence, a result of decades of neglect, understaffing, poor conditions, and a system built on punishment instead of rehabilitation. For the men living inside these prisons, tomorrow is not guaranteed. Every day is a calculation. Every interaction is a risk. And survival is not about serving time. It is about managing danger in a world where violence is woven into the structure of the institution itself. In the hidden prisons of America, the wounds that hurt the most are not the ones left by knives or fistfights. They are the invisible wounds, damage carved slowly into the mind by years of heat, fear, confinement, and neglect. Inside facilities like Holman and Angola, psychological suffering is not an event. It is a condition of daily life. Men come in angry, anxious, or broken, and over time, the environment pushes them deeper into mental deterioration. For many, the damage becomes permanent. The first factor driving psychological harm is constant fear. When a prison is understaffed, violent, and unpredictable, inmates live in a constant state of alertness. This hypervigilance rewires the brain. It becomes impossible to relax. Inmates sleep lightly, listening for metal scraping or footsteps approaching their doors. Some sleep sitting up. Others avoid certain areas because they know danger can erupt at any second. This state of awareness is exhausting. Over months and years, it creates severe anxiety, paranoia, and emotional instability. The second major factor is environmental stress. Extreme heat does not only damage the body, it affects the mind. Studies show that temperatures above 95 degrees can increase aggression, confusion, and emotional irritability. Inside Holman or Angola, where cells regularly exceed 100 degrees, inmates describe feeling like their minds are melting. Some report confusion, dizziness, and panic attacks during heat waves. Men with pre-existing mental illness suffer the most, as heat worsens symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. Isolation also plays a significant role. Solitary confinement is used frequently in these prisons, not as a last resort, but as the default response to almost any problem. Inmates who request protective custody are often placed in isolation. Those who show signs of mental distress are placed there too. The cells are small, concrete, and silent. Men spend 23 hours a day alone, with almost no communication. Studies show that even a few weeks in solitary can cause depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. But in these prisons, some inmates remain there for months or years. One former inmate at Holman describes solitary as a place where the mind eats itself. He said that after a few weeks, he began talking to himself. After a few months, he lost sense of time. He couldn't remember what day it was, sometimes couldn't remember what year it was. This level of disorientation is common. The lack of human contact breaks the brain's natural patterns. Many men develop paranoia or rage. Some refuse to leave their cells, even when released from isolation, because they become afraid of open spaces. Medical neglect also worsens psychological suffering. Inmates with mental health needs often receive no treatment. Some request medication for depression or anxiety and wait weeks for a response, if one comes at all. Others lose access to their medication due to supply shortages. Without proper treatment, symptoms worsen. Anger turns into violent outbursts. Anxiety turns into panic attacks. Depression turns into self-harm or suicide attempts. The sound environment contributes to the damage. These prisons are filled with noise, shouting, metal doors slamming, fans rattling, alarms, and constant chaos. Noise at this level creates sensory overload. One Angola inmate said nights were the worst because you never get silence. Even when nothing violent is happening, the environment itself keeps the mind in a state of tension. Another psychological trigger is powerlessness. When inmates cannot control basic parts of their daily lives, when they cannot cool down, cannot get medical care, cannot fix a broken toilet, cannot protect themselves, they begin to lose their sense of identity. This leads to emotional withdrawal. Men become numb. They stop reporting issues because they no longer believe anything will improve. This emotional shutdown is a survival mechanism, but it damages the ability to reconnect with normal life. Many inmates describe a transformation that happens after a few years in these environments. They begin to think differently. They trust no one. They expect betrayal. They see every person as a potential threat. They lose interest in things they once cared about. Some say they forget how to feel emotions properly. Joy feels foreign. Compassion feels dangerous. Hope feels foolish. This psychological shift affects their behavior inside and after release. Inside the prison, emotional numbness makes conflicts escalate quickly. When empathy fades, violence becomes easier. Some participate in gang activity because it offers structure and protection. Others isolate themselves, becoming socially withdrawn. Those with untreated trauma often lash out in ways that create disciplinary records, keeping them in maximum security conditions longer. For men who eventually leave these prisons, the psychological damage does not stay behind. Many return to society with symptoms of PTSD. Loud noises trigger panic. Small rooms make them anxious. Crowds feel threatening. Some cannot sleep in dark rooms without feeling watched. Others avoid relationships because they cannot process trust or vulnerability. The hypervigilance that once kept them alive inside now becomes a barrier to normal life. Families notice the change immediately. Former inmates might become distant, unable to communicate emotions. Some struggle with anger or explosive reactions to minor frustrations. Others become numb and emotionally flat. Without therapy, many drift into homelessness, addiction, or reoffending, not because they are bad people, but because their minds were reshaped by years of neglect and fear. The psychological impact also extends to staff. Officers working extreme hours, surrounded by violence and chaos, develop similar trauma responses. Many suffer from anxiety, depression, and burnout. Some become numb to suffering, treating inmates harshly as a defensive response. Others quit before the damage becomes permanent. Even those who stay say the environment changes them forever. The system rarely addresses any of this. Mental health units in these prisons are understaffed and underfunded. Therapy sessions, when they happen, are rushed. Most care is reactive rather than preventative. Instead of counseling, inmates often receive disciplinary action. Instead of mental health support, they are placed in isolation. Instead of rehabilitation, they are left to deteriorate. The result is a prison system where psychological harm becomes part of the punishment, an unofficial addition to the sentence that is never written in court documents. It is not just the crime that determines a man's fate. It is the conditions he is forced to endure, conditions that break down the mind until the person inside barely resembles the one who entered. In America's worst prisons, the real sentence is not years in confinement. It is the slow unraveling of a human mind. The breaking point. There's a moment in every inmate's story where survival stops being instinct and becomes strategy. A moment where fear, guilt, pressure, and the crushing weight of the past collide so hard that something inside them finally snaps. For some prisoners, that moment ends in surrender. For others, it sparks something darker, a resolve built not on hope, but on desperation. In this chapter, we step inside that breaking point. The prison had its own heartbeat, a slow, heavy rhythm of metal doors clanging, radios crackling, boots striking concrete in steady patterns. Days blended into nights, and nights felt longer than the hours they contained. For Marcus, this rhythm had been his universe for months. He knew every sound, every smell, every unpredictable shift in the wind that seemed to creep through the cracks of the aging facility. But what no one saw, not the guards, not the inmates, not even the prison psychologist, was that Marcus had been slowly drifting toward a psychological cliff. And Chapter 5 begins on the day he finally reached the edge. It started with a routine check-in. Nothing unusual. A guard opened the cell door at dawn, performed the standard search, and left without incident. Marcus sat on his bunk afterward, staring at the walls so intensely that he could see shapes forming inside the cracks. Shapes he knew weren't real, but they felt familiar, like old wounds resurfacing. For the past several weeks, he had been reliving flashes of the crime he tried so hard to suppress. Not in dreams, not in memories, in hallucinations so sharp they felt like physical blows. Trauma has a way of clawing back into the mind when the body is trapped and still. And prison gave his trauma all the stillness it needed. That morning, Marcus felt it coming again. That cold wave that traveled from the base of his skull down to his fingertips. A feeling he now recognized as the prelude to another episode. His breathing changed. His thoughts became louder. His reality blurred at the edges. He tried to steady himself, whispering, "It's not real, it's not real." But the mind doesn't listen when the guilt is louder. Across the block, inmates were waking up, arguing, laughing, coughing, yelling. The typical soundtrack of incarceration. Yet none of it registered to Marcus. In his head, he could hear something else. A voice, soft, trembling, echoing from a past he never wanted to face. "Why didn't you help me?" That voice belonged to someone he had tried to forget. Someone his crime had silenced forever. Marcus squeezed his fists until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream just to drown out the memory, but he knew screaming would bring attention. And attention in prison was a double-edged blade, sometimes protection, sometimes danger. Instead, he stood, pacing the length of his cell, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. Over and over, he pressed his fingertips to his temples, forcing himself to breathe. But the harder he fought the memory, the deeper it sank its claws into him. Then the vision came. At first, he saw only the outline of a shadow. Then it sharpened into a figure. Then into a face. The same face he saw the night the police placed handcuffs on his wrists. The same face that had stared lifeless on a cold linoleum floor. Marcus stumbled back until his spine hit the concrete wall. And for the first time in his incarceration, he cried. This wasn't the silent, restrained, crying inmates hid under their blankets at night. This was raw, uncontrolled, the kind that forced the body to shake, the kind that broke you in half. Everything he had bottled up, the guilt, the pain, the regret, the mental exhaustion, came crashing down at once. At the same time, a guard passing the cells paused when he heard movement that didn't sound right. Peeking in, he saw Marcus curled on the floor, rocking lightly. He didn't yell or call for backup. He had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize a psychological collapse. He quietly radioed, "Mental health check in cell 214, and waited. Minutes later, the prison therapist arrived. A calm woman with steady eyes and a voice that could cut through panic without force. She knelt outside the bars and spoke gently. "Marcus, look at me. You're safe. Stay here with me." Her tone wasn't commanding. It was grounding, exactly what he needed to pull himself from the spiraling hallucination. Marcus raised his head, tears streaking his face. His voice cracked. I can't do this anymore." She nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about what's happening. You're not alone in this." For the next hour, the therapist sat with him. Not judging, not rushing, just listening. Marcus confessed everything he had been hiding. The visions, the nightmares, the guilt that followed him like a chain heavier than the ones around his ankles. He admitted he hadn't slept in days. He admitted he was afraid, not of other inmates, not of guards, but of his own mind. And when the therapist asked him what triggered this breakdown, Marcus finally spoke about the moment that changed his life forever. The moment that defined the crime that put him here. "It was supposed to be an argument," he said, voice shaky. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But I lost control. And when it was over, I couldn't undo it." Silence filled the cell. Not the usual tense silence of prison. A heavy, almost sacred quiet. The therapist didn't interrupt. She let him speak until his voice faded into whispers. She knew this wasn't the end of his recovery. It was the beginning of a long, painful process. But it was the moment he finally stopped running from the truth. Before leaving, she said something Marcus would replay in his mind for weeks. "You can't change what happened, but you can choose what happens from this point forward." That sentence planted a seed, small, fragile, but real. For the first time since entering prison, Marcus felt something other than fear or guilt. He felt possibility. But in prison, moments of vulnerability don't stay private for long. Word travels, and Marcus's breakdown, his lowest point, became the topic of whispered conversations in the yard, in the cafeteria, and even inside the cells of inmates who didn't even know his last name. Some saw weakness. Some felt sympathy. Some saw opportunity. Inside a prison, weakness is louder than any scream. It spreads through the cell blocks like smoke, invisible but suffocating, pulling predators closer and pushing safety further away. And when Marcus reached his breaking point, when the walls finally crushed the weight he'd tried so hard to hide, the prison didn't comfort him. It watched. It listened. And then it reacted. The day after Marcus' breakdown moved differently, like the air itself had changed its texture. Prison always had tension, but now that tension had a direction, and it was pointed straight at him. Everyone had heard something. Not the full story, not the hallucinations, not the voice from his past, just the important part. Marcus had cracked. In a place where reputation meant survival, that single truth traveled faster than the guards could walk the tiers. By breakfast, whispers slithered through the cafeteria. Men stared longer than usual. Forks scraped metal trays in eerie rhythm. Conversations paused whenever Marcus walked past. The sound of smothered laughter floated behind him. In prison, perception could kill. He sat alone at a corner table, his untouched tray cooling in front of him. His appetite had vanished. He could feel eyes carving into him. A voice finally cut through the tension. "You good, bro?" Marcus looked up. It was Dante, an older inmate who carried the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. He wasn't affiliated with any gang. He wasn't feared, but he was respected, which, in many ways, was far more dangerous. Marcus nodded, though the answer wasn't true. Dante sat across from him without asking permission, elbows on the table. "Heard you had a moment yesterday." Marcus stiffened. "People need to mind their business." Dante chuckled softly. "This is prison. People don't mind their own business. They survive by knowing everybody else's." Marcus didn't respond. Dante leaned in, lowering his voice. "Listen, this place ain't kind to men who break. You need to get your mind right. Fast." Marcus felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. Get your mind right. Get control. Stop slipping. But how do you control something you can't see? A memory that attacks you from the inside? The therapist's words echoed in his head. You can't change what happened, but you can choose what happens from this point forward. He wanted to believe that. He needed to. But the prison environment wasn't built for healing. It was built for surviving. And survival required strength, or the appearance of it. Half an hour later, as the inmates returned to their units, Marcus felt the shift coming. Two younger inmates, both gang-affiliated, started trailing him down the hall. Their footsteps matched his. Their eyes never left his back. Not a coincidence. Marcus didn't slow down, didn't speed up. He kept his pace steady, heart racing but face calm. He reached his cell and stepped inside. The door clanged shut behind him, but not before one of the men whispered loud enough for him to hear. Dead men walk quiet. Marcus sat on his bunk, adrenaline burning through him. They weren't planning to kill him. Not yet. But they were testing him, weighing him, studying how the weak point in his armor could benefit them. Pressure built in his chest. He was slipping again. Flashbacks collided in his mind. The fight, the confrontation, the moment everything spiraled out of control before his arrest. And now, it felt like it was happening again. Different place. Same danger. Same panic. Marcus clenched his eyes shut. Not here. Not now. He breathed in deeply, grounding himself the way the therapist taught him. Slow inhale. Slow exhale. But grounding only worked when the outside world stayed quiet. The outside world didn't. That afternoon, while inmates gathered in the yard, one of the same gang members approached him. Tattoos climbed across his neck like blackened vines. His grin was wide, but not friendly. "Marcus," he said, stepping close enough that Marcus could feel the heat from his breath. "We heard you ain't doing so good." Marcus kept his gaze forward. No shame in it. Some men ain't built for this place. He circled Marcus slowly, sizing him up like a predator studying wounded prey. "You hear voices?" he taunted. "See shadows." Marcus' jaw tightened. It was a trap. Any reaction, fear, anger, defensiveness, would fuel the fire. In prison, emotional reaction was currency, something others could spend against you. So he stayed silent. The inmate smirked. "Look at you. Shaking. You gonna cry again?" Marcus didn't know if it was courage or exhaustion, but something made him look the man directly in the eyes. "Walk away," Marcus said quietly. The yard fell into a hush. The inmate blinked. "What you say?" Marcus repeated it louder. "Walk away." There was no yelling, no threats, just a tone that came from a place deeper than fear, a tone born from someone who had nothing left to lose. Dante appeared behind Marcus, arms crossed. "Problem?" Dante asked calmly. The gang member scoffed and took a step back. "Nah, no problem." But the way he said it was a promise, not of peace, but of future conflict. When they left, Dante placed a hand on Marcus' shoulder. "That was stupid," he said quietly, "but brave." Marcus exhaled shakily. "I'm done letting people break me." Dante nodded. "Good, because if they smell blood, they'll tear you apart. You need to decide who you're going to be in here, not who you were out there. In here, your past don't protect you." Marcus understood. His transformation couldn't be emotional. It had to be strategic. He had to rebuild himself, not from strength, but from awareness. For the first time, Marcus felt a strange kind of clarity, a realization. His mind wasn't just his greatest weakness. It could become his greatest weapon. He knew how guilt worked. He knew how trauma twisted thoughts. He knew how fear spread. And he knew he wasn't the only one fighting demons behind these walls. As the yard slowly emptied, Marcus stood alone under the fading sunlight. For once, he wasn't running from his mind. He was learning it, accepting it, understanding that the collapse wasn't the end of him. It was the beginning of a new version of himself. A version that would not break again. A version that would not be prey.